Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to represent this evening. My name is Nader Tehrani. I'm serving as the Dean of the Irwin S. Channon School of Architecture. With the weight of global events, the hurricane in Puerto Rico, the human tragedy in Las Vegas, and the implosion of discourse in Washington, D.C., it is sometimes hard to imagine how architecture can contribute to the urgencies of the moment with its own instruments. Moreover, there are few architects with an international presence or authority that can speak to such cultural and environmental issues and that can capture an audience broader than our own cohort. Tonight's speaker, Daniel Libeskind, is one such person, and I'm proud to have joined the very school of which he is an exemplary alumnus. Libeskind leapt onto the world scene with the winning of the Jewish Museum competition in Berlin in 1989, and while his name is attached to several memorials and buildings commemorating the victims of the Holocaust, what is maybe more important is that his voice has become synonymous with the cause of humanity itself. After September 11th, 2001, Daniel Libeskind's studio won the competition for the master plan of the World Trade Center. In a complex collaboration with local stakeholders, he's weathered a tough balance between the need to give memory to the tragic occasion on the one hand, while imagining a future for the site that is active, optimistic, and part of a living city on the other. Standing here and looking at the Great Hall, it is wonderful to see how this space continues to foster dialogue, debate, and the challenges of our time. And there's maybe no one like Daniel that can deliver the necessary magnitude of polemic, be it through drawings, buildings, or the narratives that are attached to his multivalent practice. Born in Lodz, Poland in 1946, Mr. Libeskind immigrated to the United States as a teenager and with his family settled in the Bronx. After studying music in New York and Israel on an American-Israel Cultural Foundation scholarship, he developed into a musical virtuoso before eventually leaving music to study architecture. He received his professional degree in architecture from the Cooper Union in 1970 and a postgraduate degree in the history and theory of architecture from the School of Comparative Studies at Essex University in England. For all the pedigree, maybe the most defining part of Libeskind's trajectory is marked by the moment he met Nina Lewis, now also Libeskind, whose personal and professional partnership defines their shared oeuvre more than any other feature. Long before the Jewish Museum and the World Trade Center, we grew up with the work of Libeskind with the wonders of chamberworks, a series of drawings that are so exquisitely crafted as they are inexplicable if measured against the canons of architectural composition. And despite this, or maybe precisely because of it, the work brought to architectural discourse a wide array of interpretations from voices as far-reaching and dissonant as Robin Evans, Jeff Kipnis, or our own Tony Vidler. Evans describes the impotence of architectural criticism in facing these drawings as if he, of all people, were ill-equipped to engage them outside the tenets of signification, which was the basis for dominant thinking at the time. Describing the abstraction of the graphic markings of the work beyond unity and fragmentation, Kipnis tries to identify how the work produces a space that defies all the logics we have inherited. At once blurred, fused, and grafted without recourse to the identification of seams, the very moments where we recognize the limits of one technique in relationship to the next. 28 drawings in total. Chamber Works was done in a productive period of 7 years aligned with Libeskind's directorship of the Cranbrook Architecture Program from 78 to 85. A pedagogical moment that also defines a good many of other significant professors out there today. Utterly dissatisfied with the practices of professional offices, the inadequacies of corporate agency, and the conventions of the discipline at large, The launching of Libeskind's own practice was itself an assault on the profession as we knew it. Naturally, the translation of drawings to models and the scaling up of representations to buildings did not come without its own challenges. But what is undeniable is Libeskind's professional ascent, a phenomena that tends to draw anyone from the margins of practice to the center of authority, power, and the establishment. And throughout this, the practice has held certain architectural ethics intact, and curious ones that are maybe more defining if seen as telltale details, or tropes, as I will call them. In an artistic and technical discipline that is largely defined by synthesis and the coordination of complex, heterogeneous parts, Libeskind's buildings are characterized by two unique tropes. The first, a fascination with the power of the graphic marking, often ambiguous, abstract and raw, but also suggestive, elusive, and reflective of cultural ghosts. Not quite symbols, ideograms, or hieroglyphs, but also not innocent of the semantic cloud they might produce. The second is an equal fascination with the idea of the figure. Buildings with provocative bodies, torqued, shaped and contoured with a predisposition towards geometric and formal complexity, but much like the superficial strategies suspended between abstraction and legibility. What is maybe consistent about both the superficial and figural surpluses of these buildings is that they're ultimately informed by externalities. That is, questions of program, environmental systems, or tectonic organizations are all somehow addressed, but not necessarily part of the architectural rush to synthesis. They're accommodated, and maybe even championed in certain instances, but what constitutes the salient aspects of these buildings can never be reduced to them. And herein lies my own fascination with the work. In a discipline that is largely defined by accountability, the consistency of this body of work produces a surplus in formal, spatial, and rhetorical terms. And that surplus emerges from the misalignment between parts, neither completely random nor quite discernible, but always swerving away from accountability if measured by conventional terms. Libeskind thrives from the misalignments between form and content, or the inside and the outside, if you like. And through this, he produces a conscious loose fit, both physically and theoretically, to create a space within which architecture's externalities liberate us from the everyday, perchance to elevate us beyond to the sublime. If the institution of architecture holds integration, reciprocity, and correspondence as the measure of representational morality, then Libeskind inverts this very tenet by engaging externalities as the very substance of architecture itself, as if the structure were supported by the skin, bringing an entirely different set of ethical claims to the equation. You've been very patient with me. Now, before I welcome Daniel to the stage, may I ask anyone who has questions to write them on an index card, and we can, I think there's a box somewhere up here where you can put them in, and we will curate them at the end. And now, let me invite Daniel to join us up on stage.
Thank you, Nader. Wow. It's difficult to speak after such a profound, articulate, well put together thought. I don't know where to begin, but I'm thrilled to be here. Not just in this beautiful and historic hall, but in this school, because when I was in high school, I was in the Bronx High School of Science, and I really didn't know what to do, because most of my colleagues went to MIT. They were already geniuses when they started high school, but I had no idea where to go. And then someone told me, well, apply to Cooper Union. I thought of applying to City College. There was a whole list of schools which were, full scholarship schools. But I was so glad I came here because I met so many geniuses in the school. I would not be the person I am today had I not been lucky. And of course, every student is lucky because of their parents, because of their family, because of where they come from. But you really never know your true luck, but in retrospect. And so when I think of my teachers here, Richard Meyer, Peter Eisenman, the great John Haydock, the Dean of the School of Architecture, how amazing in that period of change where everything was changing in architecture. It was being challenged in a school which stood as a kind of in opposition to the official dogma of corporate architecture, the New York Five, so to speak. So let me give you a little personal kind of journey here. I start with, and that's the name of this lecture, Between Zero and Infinity. When I graduated school, some years later, I was invited by the great Toshio Nakamura, editor of Architecture and Urbanism in Tokyo, to say, why don't we do an issue on your work, Mr. Libeskind? You did some interesting work. We need some young blood, that haven't yet built any buildings. So I put together a thing, my work, and I sent it, and I was so excited. And it came back to me with a letter saying, Dear Mr. Libeskind, we thought we had invited you to do architecture, but you didn't submit anything in architecture, so here is all this work back. So I was, you can see how dejected one could be. I went and I spoke with my master, John Haydock, of course, often, and he said, when he saw the box, I brought the box back, it was all the stems from Japan. He said, I got an idea. Why don't you go to Rizzoli and show them this box? And how lucky was I that Rizzoli published my first book, which was called Between Zero and Infinity, which contained my work from school and subsequently. That's me in school. God, school is so much fun because you're completely naive. And the whole idea is don't ever become too smart. Be as naive as you were there. I think we were designing a fire station. Second year architecture, it's so much fun. It's life-giving. Architecture, even in a dark time that we go through today, is something inspiring because it's about people. It's about life. And that's what I was doing in school. That's in my last year of school. I started cutting up drawings and trying to put them together into architectural wholes, creating experiments in collage, creating strange torn up buildings. And then when I left school, I continued my experiments. I continued to work in 3 dimensions, creating models. Really, I never believed that I should, I tried working in offices, I gotta be honest, but it just didn't appeal to me. It looked too dull. And then, I started doing collages. I had the urge. And by the way, you take a path in life. And don't believe the gurus. There are always gurus to tell you you should have a goal in life and try to get to that goal. I never had any goal. Never. I still don't. But you gotta have a path. And be careful not to be swung to the left or to the right of that path. So I began a series of drawings. And I truly believe, and I think this school gave me that kind of mystical, philosophical, deep thought that architecture comes from something very humble, like a drawing. And I started a series I called Micromegas, inspired by Voltaire's great essay on scale and size. And they were not really representing any buildings because I had no clients. And I was never of the type of person who would try to fantasize about buildings and social situations. It just wasn't in me. I guess because my mother and my father came from deep Jewish roots, my mother from a very Hasidic root, and she was also an anarchist, by the way, who organized a strike. My parents were, she worked in sweatshops as a seamstress. She organized one day a strike, and I said, what was the strike about? She said, I organized a strike because there was no soap for the workers after work. And I said, who was the strike against? She said it was against the employers and against the union. So I learned something from my mother. This is Chamberworks. It was beautifully spoken by Nader. It's a series of drawings. I have really no obvious source to how to comment on them, but all I know is they consumed me. And when I read, if you have read Vasari's Lives of the Artists and read Uccello's Discovery of Perspective, that's what I felt like. I was in a dark room. Nina was taking care of the kids. I mean, how lucky am I to work with her? And he came out of the dark room tearing his hair and said, I discovered something incredible. It's with lines and it's with points. I had a kind of same feeling, although it was not a building. It was a kind of post-perspective view of architecture and structure. But believe it or not, I've used these drawings in my practice. These are not drawings that I filed away. I've used them as instruments of what I do. And more recently, a series called Sonnets in Babylon, which was displayed actually in the Venice Pavilion. They asked me to do the station. It's a series of completely different drawings. And I always think you have to really work with drawings, especially if you don't have a job and if you don't work for another company. What are you going to do with your time? Well, you've got to be lucky enough to be supported by a wife who's working and is giving you the chance. And believe me, I would never do what I do if Nina was not with me, because she provided the time. And now I look back, I was really irresponsible if I think about it. Working. Then when I was at Cranbrook, I entered another world. And with my students, I won the Lion in Venice Biennale in a competition for, really, what is a city? I created a kind of spiritual experience. I built this wheel and I made the books. It's kind of a return of the same. And the books were, I only made the number of books that fit on the shelves. Unfortunately, the whole project was, I'll tell you later, was destroyed. But yeah, it was kind of medieval way, working without machine tools, working without electricity, kind of putting yourself in the shoes, in the kind of poor shoes of a great time of the illumination of the medieval world. Then I created the memory machine. So it went a little, further into the Renaissance, the puppetry of thought, the illusionistic world of the puppets whose strings were pulled from various sources. And I created kind of my own kind of theater of memory. A little, it was big, hard to build, but it contained all sorts of things that I thought should be remembered. The way Palladio created the Teatro Olimpico. You look around in order to remember what is worth remembering in a world which always loses memory. Then I created my ultra sophisticated graphite, writing machine. So reading, remembering, writing. It had these 49 cubes rotated, by many people to create random patterns of sainthood, of emblematic cities, of reflections, of actual physical cities. And that's what I discovered, that there are so many saints. Really, there are more saints than you can believe, because for every saint there is another one. And then when I was living in Europe, I participated in competition for Potsdamer Platz. I never thought it should be rebuilt the way it was. It should be rebuilt in a completely different way from those fragments of memory and history. And then I was in a competition for Alexanderplatz, which I did not win. What won was skyscrapers and huge mega projects. But actually, I feel that I won, because what I proposed in this project for Alexanderplatz exactly happened. I proposed a kind of homeopathic approach. Don't destroy the buildings. Nobody's going to destroy those buildings. Why would you destroy buildings and build fantasies? Just improve the space, improve the public space, improve the buildings, clad them in better materials, and so on. That's indeed what happened in Berlin, where I actually was able to realize my very first building. I never even built a small building before. Never. And I have to tell you, it wasn't the Jewish Museum at all. The competition was for Berlin Museum with what they call the Jewish department. But coming from where I come from, my parents were Holocaust survivors. I didn't study history in archives, in libraries. I lived it. I lived under a communist anti-Semitic regime in Poland. So I created a building that could not have a Jewish department. because the building itself was a structure of alternating and unpredictable ways cut through by a discontinuous emptiness I call the void, and a fragmented void around which you could not orient yourself. And of course, the building doesn't have normal windows. It is a kind of a map of an invisible Berlin between addresses that you no longer see in the city plan. It has an entrance in the underground. I was the only actually architect, it was an international competition, who did not provide the obvious thing, a bridge between the two buildings, the Baroque building, which is the old courthouse, old Berlin Museum. I thought the only way to do it is to go underground, into the Baroque building, into the darkness of the Enlightenment, you know, where Hegel, Kierkegaard, Lessing, the great minds, bigoted as they were, preached a very, very evil, dark Enlightenment. So I created a dead end, the Holocaust. As far as I'm concerned, Berlin is finished. It's a different Berlin now. The Garden of Exile, with those 49 pillars, the central one filled with the Earth of Israel, 1948, the others, State of Israel, creation of the State of Israel, and the longest route, which is the continuity of Berlin's history for hope, because without hope you could not build anything, which doesn't end in an atrium. This building does not have an atrium. It has just a blank wall as you go up there, and you just slide into the collections. And by the way, the glass court that I built, which you see here, was a later addition, because originally there was not even a program for people, you know, having food or anything. So yes, it's a social place. I built an educational center across the street. My very first building. It took many years. Believe me, it would never happen without the United. The building was officially sort of chosen, but was also 1 year later officially unanimously canceled by the Senate of Berlin. Now, when something's unanimously canceled by authorities, you usually just pack your bags, which I was ready to do. But Nina is, you know, comes from a family of political fighters. She doesn't give up easily, so she said, just leave me alone. Take care of the kids for a change, which I did. So after many, many years, my first building was built, and I'm glad to say that it has made, you know, it doesn't have masterpieces in it, there's no, but it has attracted people to learn about something of their own history. And I was talking to Dr. Blumenthal, the former director, and he said to me, you know, we've had an interesting survey. We ask people, why do you come to this museum? He says 50% come because they're interested in Jewish history of Germany. 50 other percent come because they're interested in the building. So it's a good deal. I also lived in Milan. Actually, that's where I did the project for the Jewish Museum. We lived when my daughter was born in Milan. And recently I'm involved, it's still, much of it is under construction, housing. I did the master plan. I worked on this project together with Zaha Hadid, great architect, with Arata Isozaki. But this is my, you know, how do you take big blocks and create something interesting, green, with a totally different character in the great city of Milan, which has such great architecture. It's how interesting that I came back as a ghost, back to Berlin, but as back to, you know, Milan as an architect. Well, I didn't come back to Denver, but I should have, you know, I would love to live in Denver because I love the American pioneering spirit of the West. No one ever said to me, this building is strange, this building is radical, even though it is, because just people in Denver are open-minded. It's the West. They were the pioneers. They rerouted the rail so that it would go through their city. Otherwise, you would have just missed Denver altogether. And again, it's a museum of contemporary art. It's projections, it's performance art. It's, you know, the oldest artists, I think the last director told me that they don't want to have any artists who are older than 40 in the building. Wow, fantastic, great. And how strange I returned in this journey back to my country, Poland. Who would have ever thought that I would be building here in Warsaw, the tallest residential tower in Europe, 65 stories high, on Zlota Street, Gold Street. That's very close to where my mother lived, in the old Jewish neighborhood in the center of the city, right across from the Stalin Palace that I saw as a kid. And I understood it as a kid, something to oppress the people of Poland. And I rediscovered, of course, I'm a Polish person. I'm from Poland. I love Chopin. I read Bruno Schulz in Polish. What an amazing country. coming across the darkness of communism, which I experienced as a kid, anti-Semitism and so on, to a new place. Of course, it has right-wing government today, but let's give it a chance. Countries do change. And I came back to Toronto, a city where I lived with Nina, where one of my kids was born, and was able to create the Crystal, a new museum on a main street that has really changed Toronto. It's controversial. How amazing that the Torontonians, the Canadians, are pretty conservative. It's still a controversial building, believe it or not, even though it has the largest number of visitors in any museum in Canada. Half of it is nature, half of it is art. But I based it on a crystal because, first of all, I love crystals. Second of all, there's the best collection of crystals at the Royal Ontario Museum. And you gotta do things that you love. You can't just do things that you're expected to do. And of course, what brought me to New York again, back, it was ground zero. And I have to tell you, it's a complex project. You have so many stakeholders, starting with the families of the victims in the thousands. You've got the Port Authority, a behemoth, with 7,000 architects and engineers, run by the governors of New York and New Jersey. You've got the mayor of New York in charge of city streets. You've got the path authorities, subway authorities. But I thought about my parents. They were working people. My father was a printer on Stone Street and Broad Street. And my mother in the sweatshops. My father worked in pretty bad conditions. And I thought, what do they get? If they were alive, what would they would never be in those tall buildings. They're not in the media companies. Where are they going to be? They're going to be in the subways, the trains, running to work, running back to feed the kids. What do they get? That's what I thought. It should be something that opens the streets of New York, that has public space. And by the way, it's not that easy when you have a 16-acre site, 10 million square feet of office space, 5 million square feet of culture and infrastructure. You've got complex laws to use only half of the site. Only 8 acres are used for the construction. And I thought, yes, the most important thing is not to build in the center. All my friends, Norman Foster, others, built megastructure, huge buildings in the center of the city. I thought, of course it's a piece of real estate, very expensive, but nobody declared it sacred. I thought it's just not proper. You can't build where people perished. And I kept the slurry wall, which is that big wall underground, if you've been to the museum. It was not easy to keep it. I thought, this is a dam. This is the wall that prevents the waters of the Hudson of the Atlantic, coming into all the subways. This should stand still the foundation of the site today, but it's difficult to build a living foundation which is not with weight on top of it. I created an extra space. You see there the wedge of light, space determined by 846 southern side of tower number 2, not yet built, and 1028, which is the center of the PET terminal, Calatrava. And of course, I worked with all the architects to garner consensus with all the parties, because I believe in democracy. I believe in developing a scheme that people can agree. Of course, the developers initially didn't want it. They wanted the towers near Wall Street and so on. But I wanted to make a scheme that any New Yorker, any working person in New York, as my parents were, could go there and breathe freely. And I, by the way, introduced water in my scheme, which was made fun of by the cover of the Post, I remember. They said Niagara Falls in New York. What a stupid idea. But people like the water, because the water, and in Michael Arad's scheme, it's very beautiful. The water has an effect of what I intended, which is to screen the busy sounds of the city and have an individual experience of where you are. Memory, but at the same time, happiness, streets that are vital, beautiful connections, vistas. You can enter it from any neighborhood, Tribeca, Battery Park, Wall Street, Chinatown, from the water side, from East Side. Make it permeable, make it something that is living and that shows the resilience and power of New York. Okay, now to my more didactic lecture, because home is the center of architecture. And I never had a chance, really, to design a home. But I was so lucky to have a client who said, a couple, who came to me and said, can you build us a home? I said, well, not so large in Connecticut. I said, oh my God, somebody asked me to build a home. They're fantastic. And I fell in love with them. Because when you do a home, it's a very intimate thing, right? You can't be an abstract architect doing a white cube. You've got to talk to your clients. You've got to find out, what do your clients like? How do they get up in the morning? What do they want to see? So I created really, I would would say, an unprecedented home. What is architecture? It's a fold in intersubjective relations. That's what it is. It's a fold in human relations. It's not about space just, and that's kind of what I did, creating portraits, creating, it is reflective stainless steel, and it doesn't have any constant color because sometimes it's black, sometimes it's light blue, sometimes it's green, depending where you are approaching it, what time of the day, what angle. I don't think there are two angles the same. There's not a single orthogonal in the building. I don't think so. I might be wrong, but I don't think so. So to live in a sense in the round, in the fullness, and how lucky I was that my clients, it appealed to them, this strong sharpness, but also the warmth, because the house is not veneer, it's a thick oak. And I think that's a good combination, to be sharp, articulate on the outside, but warm. And that's a reflection of my clients. They are sharp and warm. And so this oak, and they allowed me to do almost everything. The kitchen, the sofa, the bath and the shower. My God, I never liked those English, bathtubs with the round curves and those medical-looking things. I was able to design even a faucet. Can you believe that? Which, opens and then closes like a straight line. How lucky am I? And the lighting in the house, an atmosphere that kind of promotes the mystery of love, because that's what a house is about. The bedroom, such an important part of the house. The light of the house, nighttime, winter. So again, working very closely with your clients, falling in love with them, and creating something that is a home and not a house. Then I was able to do a school very recently. It's not any school. It's a school of fundamental physics in one of the most beautiful places called Durham. And you see this kind of circle arc that goes into kind of chaotic spiral within. Well, there it is. You can spot the building somewhere there. You can see it's slightly different in shape. Small building, 3 stories, kind of, short of 100 offices. It's a building for fundamental physics for some of the greatest scientists in the world. Dr. Frank, who is one of famous cosmologists. My son, by the way, is a theoretical astrophysicist. And Lord Rees, Martin Rees, opened the building. He's the royal astronomer who has written all the books that I've always admired. So what is the building? I tried to make a building that is kind of has the cosmic geometry of some sort. Has a kind of spiral that is accurately drawn, and you can see it here within this site. It's a drawing, it's a complicated drawing, but it's got a whole plan inside of it. And it's a building that also has an urban focus in order to connect this beautiful campus from which you can see that amazing cathedral, probably the best cathedral in the UK, this incredible place. Here, it's very simple, but I tried to make every floor flow into the other. So it's just mostly offices. That's what science is about. They don't want collective big rooms. Everybody wants to have their private office. They have to meditate, but they need also social spaces, which you can see are a result of the spiral. It's not a very obvious spiral, and of course, the spiral is three-dimensional. You can look across. You have light. You can see the glazed doors, windows of the offices, so the light comes inside. But to be a scientist, you have to also have a warmth. So I created a building in concrete. It's very modest budget, concrete and wood. And my son told me the most important thing is to have privacy late at night. You've got to come up with ideas. But also you've got to be able to talk to people around the corner. You have to be able to have a cup of coffee. You have to have a nice office. And offices have those diagonal columns. And some of them, of course, Dr. Carlos Frank has the best office, looking at the cathedral. He deserves it. He's one of the royal science masters. And it's a simple building, wooden building, large, local, Scottish. Simple building, but it's a huge challenge to design a simple building, which really would have been just a box with a double-loaded corridor. But try to make it kind of a cosmic emblem of the complexity of what goes in the mind of people who work on the most abstract and most relevant problems of space. And so the building is a home, is a place, It has changed certainly the character of the campus, and really it's like this early drawing that I try to say, how can we bring that turbulence, the fact, as Rilke said, if we stand on the ground for a minute, we should feel totally nauseous. We should feel unstable, groundless. We are floating in space at a huge rate per second, and we are thinking that we are standing on stable ground. That's school. City, a very important topic. How do you build a whole city? And here, in a beautiful little city-state, Singapore, I had a chance to build on the old docklands. Now, the docklands are a theme almost everywhere in my project in Dublin, elsewhere too. People have rediscovered that water is the water of life. And so the old docklands at Keppel Bay became a challenge for housing. Because, it's relatively easy to do a unique museum. It's relatively easy to do something special. But to do something that is really the bread and butter of architecture, that's housing. And I thought a lot, how do I do housing which is interesting and which is kind of progressive? So you see that chain, kind of the jeweled chain of smaller buildings, larger buildings, in a very tight site. And my idea was, how do you maximize the open space? There's not a lot of open space. So that's interesting anecdote. I made these doubly curved towers. They're not just curved, not sails, it's not a facade. It's every floor is on a different position in space. So you're never above or below a neighbor. You just shifted off the line. And I created this, and the developers said, great, wonderful, we won the competition. Then when it came to designing it, they said, oh, no, Mr. Libeskind, it's a little too expensive. Let's just drop one of the idea is nice, but it's enough to have just a nice curve in the front. But the authorities in Singapore are very progressive. So when the developers went back, they said, sorry, we are not giving the permission we gave you to raise the buildings 40% more in height because of their shape. We take it away, go ahead. Of course, the developers very quickly said, we'll do the double curve. And that's important because, I coupled the towers, tall ones and shorter ones. The bridges are amenities for people who live there. You can see the lower buildings also as part of creating sort of pedestrian space, enlivening the promenade with cafes, with pavilions, places for people to live. It's a daring city. Has a lot of great architects, bring the green to the top of the crowns, and creating really something which is economically viable. It's not too expensive. It has the same market rate as all the other buildings. It was sold even before it was built. So obviously the developers then asked me to do another project right next door, which is called the Corals. It's a very different project because in a very tight site, had different regulations. But I did something we did because there's a great team here, and I cannot credit myself. There are geniuses who work with us, and I can't name all of them, but without them, what would we be doing? Nothing. So this is a different strategy. Make the lowest building on the waterfront, make the highest building in the back so everybody gets a view of Keppel Bay. And again, the head of the housing authority, now retired, told me that when I opened this project, said, I was sitting in one of these apartments, and I already have a beautiful apartment in Singapore, and I said to my husband, I'd like to buy this apartment. It's even better than where we live. That's the best commendation. If the head of the planning authority buys an apartment in your project, that's really good news. So that's housing, and that's, of course, perhaps would not be called affordable housing because Singapore is a different, but I am also working on affordable housing as we speak, and I'm a great believer that we have to bring the same high level of ambition. Here is another project. Strangely, we won several competitions in France. I never built anything in France. Suddenly, it's my French year in a beautiful pink city, Toulouse, rather a low city, and proposed a tower It's not just a private tower. There's public spaces. There are varied programs. It's on the railway lands to bring the beautiful Canal du Midi, it's one of the famous canals sung by great French poets, into the skyline and create on this divide of railway tracks a space that will be a future connector to the city. Of course, it's the tallest building in the city, but the city wanted it. They wanted to change the idea of Toulouse. Toulouse is not just this low city, horizontal. It's got aspirations. It's got a sense of moving forward. It's a city that is not only beautiful, but it's not a secondary city. It's just how we think about these cities. It used to be primary back in the 15th century, 16th century. It's going to be primary again. So I was lucky to work with authorities, with developers who were interested to create the base as a public base, mixed program, residential, and also public spaces at the very tip of the tower, which is really fantastic because only from there can you see the Pyrenees. When you're in the lower levels of the city, you can't really see the Pyrenees. But with this garden, and it's a complicated thing to build a garden all the way up. It doesn't look like just a bunch of things in planters. It's a challenge, but it's going into construction. War. We're surrounded by wars. And I recently completed a project for the Military History Museum of Germany. And somebody said to me, Mr. Libeskind, how can you're Jewish, you build a Jewish museum, how can you work on the German Military History Museum, which, by the way, is the biggest museum in Germany, not by accident. War had played a huge role in German history. I said yes, because in a democracy, and Germany is a democracy, we saw that 13% of the vote in the last election went to a Nazi party, but it's a democracy. We have to support democracy. And Dresden, was the most beautiful city considered in the world. It was the Venice of the North, with the most beautiful buildings, spectacular architecture, collections of art. You look at this Bellotto painting, you can't believe this photograph. And this photograph is a photograph right after the bombings, of the Allied bombings in 1945. Completely devastated. The city is just leveled. And what a photograph with this disturbing angel left over, lost on some rooftop. So I created a building for this armory. It started as an armory in the 19th century, then became, the Saxony Museum, then became the Museum of the Nazi Party, Nazi Museum. Then it became the Soviet Museum, of course, the Russians occupied Dresden. Then it became the East German Museum. And then when Germany was unified again, they thought, what are we going to do with this building? How are we going to go on with our history? And I'm so glad that they selected my project, because I did something which no other architect, big competition, did. They said, build a building in the back of the U-shape of the armory. In the back, like the entrance of the Louvre, in the back of the U-shape. I said, no, you can't hide military history in Germany. You have to cut through the building all the way, not as a facade, but you have to create a point of direction that cuts all the old structure out and juts itself out. And you can see the geometry. It's pointing at the first bomb. It was triangulation of bombers that destroyed Dresden. It's pointing to the first, very close to the building, the first place where the bomb fell. So it's a view of the rebuilt Dresden, which is, fantastic city, Baroque city, but it's pointing also, you are inside of that pattern. And the building in plan, you can see that it's kind of tilting, and it's interrupting that chronology of history exactly between 1914 and 1945. Those were the years of catastrophe for the world, and militarism, authoritarianism, dictatorship, killing, murder. I wanted to create a building that doesn't just extend the military history, but pauses to ask questions about what history is. And here you can see the building cuts through the columns. I renovated the armory. It was very badly treated by East Germans. I renovated it, to expose, the curves, the arches. Then I cut through it, and on the left, you can see there's the beginning of the exhibit, and it's the text of Clausewitz. If you haven't read it, on war, please read it, because every general has read it in West Point. It's the permanence. Why is there permanence of war in the world? And of course, there's the oblique lines. The first exhibit is about animals. I didn't know. I knew about the lions of Judah and the elephants of Hannibal, but who connects it with the pigeons sent in World War I, with Laika the dog sent into space, with biological warfare, how we have captured nature. There is no nature. We've transformed what was called nature into part of the mission to fight, to destroy. It's very interesting, the toys. This is, you can see the old stair, because I preserved the building completely. And by the way, the cut is just 2 lines cutting through the main wall, which is protected historically. But the toys, Weimar toys, we all play, all kids love toys, toy guns. And some emblematic objects like this alouette. I think in French it's a lark. It's a beautiful singing bird. That's what the French called this military helicopter. And of course, things that come down from the sky to destroy. That's war. But in that wedge, there are really hardly any exhibits. There are questions. And the questions are, why do people follow authoritarian leaders? Why do they agree? Why do they step in march? Why do they pull the trigger? Why do they kill? I don't think there are answers easily to this question. We can see it in our own country. There are no easy answers. Why do people march? Why do they follow? But you get to the top of the Military History Museum, which is, by the way, like the West Point. It's where the military learns its history. German history from the Teutonic Knights in 12th century all the way to the military in NATO, German military in Afghanistan and so on. You get to the top and you see the fragments of destroyed cities from Dresden, Wieliczka in Poland, Coventry in the UK. Many cities destroyed from Dresden. And then you exit the building. And this is something I can only tell you, you can only feel it physically. You're on an oblique plane and there's wind. You're outside of the museum. You're suspended high up in the wind of history. And I think that's really what the experience at the end is. That's what history is. You're suspended alone. And on one side, you see the beautiful panorama of Dresden as you look around. Wow, the rebuilt Frauenkirche and so on. But you're standing in the formation of the exact geometry of the tools that destroyed that city. So that's the story of the belief in democracy, that in a democratic country, you have to understand that soldiers, the military, are not running the country. They are responsible to the citizens, to the civic society. Memory. Well, that's something that I think is not a footnote. It's the fundamental dimension of architecture. We would really not know where we are, not know where we are going, not be aware. We would be Alzheimer's patients who have forgotten, who have to be told, and they don't process. A memorial I opened just a few days ago with Prime Minister Trudeau and Holocaust survivors in Ottawa, the capital of Canada. Turns out that Canada is the last country, was allied country in World War II, that did not have a Holocaust monument of any sort. Wow. So there was a competition, and I entered it with Erd Bertinsky, a great artist, with landscape architects. And you can see I based it on star, the kind of Star of David projected from a certain angle, and also on triangles. And I based it on this. I don't know whether you noticed, but when the Nazis took over in 1933, very quickly, right next to Berlin, on an S-Bahn stop, Sachsenhausen camp, which I also worked on. Nothing ever happened there architecturally, but I prevented a shopping center to be built there. But they had a typology of triangles. The Jews just had the double triangle, but everybody else, Roma, political prisoners, communists, people mentally ill, physically ill, Jehovah's Witnesses. It was a catastrophic typology of murder, and I created that. Homosexuals also were part of that star. So I created this. It's next to the War Museum, a very beautiful building by Mariama, one of the great Canadian architects, in the background. And you can see it's really straight in the middle of the city. It's concrete. You see background, there are some images on the concrete, kind of almost murals of photographs taken of places of extermination, taken today by Ed Bertinsky, taken in just this year or last year. And it has has several moments which are very different depending where you come from. There's several entrances. It's a public space. It's a piazza, actually. It's not a building. It's a piazza. And I created one line that moves towards a view, a particular view, and you can see through that cut in the diagonal wall, the Parliament Tower, so-called Peace Tower. And I was very moved. First of all, I did it for one reason only, that the Holocaust, and any Holocaust, doesn't start with bullies and machine guns and people being punched on the streets. It starts with decisions of the government to deprive people of the human rights. That's how it starts. Progressive decisions that end in the decision to murder. And so I faced it towards the Parliament Tower, and I was very happy that Prime Minister Trudeau, in his speech, said this tower was not always something positive to look at, because in 1941, the ship of St. Louis with Jews who stopped in Cuba, stopped on the coast of America, stopped in Halifax, they did not let them in. And those hundreds of people had to go on the ship back to Germany. Of course, all were murdered. So it's interesting, pointing to the government, at the story of the government, story often of the injustice of governments, even in democracies. And so there are many moments to the building. There are many moments of experience. One of the most disturbing, I think, is this triangular volume which has no roof. I don't know. It's very, very disturbing. It has the eternal flame, which is... I thought that it would be important to just look at the sky. I don't know whether I have an image of it. And then there are the images on those walls and places to think of. And by the way, yeah, the sky is very important. That volume, I didn't have the right photograph, actually. As you look through that triangle, there is no roof. And what makes a place is a roof. But when you have no roof, you have the scar, the permanent scar in the sky, because, those people were never buried. They're just ashes, which we still breathe in. And that's kind of the moment. Let's speak about the future. Not memory only, but also construction. And how lucky am I to work with another genius, Dr. Richard Leakey. I mean, he and his parents have rediscovered the origins of humanity, the evolution of humanity. What a genius to discover where we all come from in Africa. And by the way, now that I think about it, if one is to point the finger at the bleakness of the Western thought, I would say it's the Holocaust and the enslavement of Africans. Those are two things that put doubt into what kind of history are we part of. So this is a project far away in Kenya, in Turkana, that Lake Turkana with salt water. It's, north from Nairobi, near Somalia, near Ethiopia. And that's where we all come from. I believe it or not, all the DNA comes from this place. We are all from there. And I actually had that feeling. It's a salt lake where they found a whale. It's mysterious. It's desert now. But the Turkana boy, Lucy, all of these things, all the traces of the 400 million years that we have been developing are right there. And the idea is to build this center of human evolution. It's interesting. Do we know where we come from? Now look at this. If you're asleep, you're missing something. Look at this. This is a day, 365 days. 365 days. And look what we come. We come in the last minute before midnight. Just look at it. Look at how little do we understand what is evolution. We think of religions, which are relatively kind of new, 10,000 years old or something. It's nothing. Look at this diagram. Oh my God. We are missing the point. How we evolved from animals, some animal-like humanoid creatures, and how we, for whatever reason, maybe because of our violence, maybe because of the idea of imagination, have produced in the last minute before midnight an illusion of eternity. So there's my drawing, first sketch for Dr. Leakey, how to create a place that refers to the DNA, that refers to ascent, that refers to shadows, that refers to knowledge, and how to create spaces that kind of show the vastness of the desert in our minds. So there's the model. As you can see, it's partly inspired by the tools I saw. I saw these amazing tools were used millions of years ago. And really, as one of the great scientists from Oxford told me, before people could develop, there had to be some genius who had an idea in his mind before seeing it, realized, had an idea how to chip a stone, how to pick a stone which could be chipped to a point. Of course, Africa is here the point, and spaces that I think will move people with its amazing exhibitions, with its shrine-like or pilgrimage-like place, will, I think, put us in a scale. Who are we? What do we think we are? Who do we think really we are? How big do we think we are with our, weapons and our capacity to destroy the world and capacity to shoot as many people as possible? What does this mean in evolutionary scale? And by the way, I say that because in my conversation with Dr. Rees, who wrote those, if you don't know the books by Martin Rees, I highly recommend them. One is just on the 6 numbers. But he told me, Mr. Libeskind, we are entering the post-human. He's a scientist. I said, what do you mean? When? He said, within the next 60 years. I said, what do you mean? He said, we're losing. Humanity is changing. We're going to be different. We are now entering. I was very disturbed by that. And so hope is a good point for my last project here. Because I'm working in a region of war, but a region that has amazing aspirations. It's the Middle East. And where is it? It's in the oldest inhabited city in the world, continually inhabited. It's not Jerusalem, it's not Jericho, it's Erbil in Kurdistan. And how lucky I am to be able to go to Kurdistan, to speak with Gwyn Roberts, who's done the oral history of the Kurdish people, the people who were never given freedom. No, we don't even know who are the 60 million Kurds. Why is the world against the Kurds? Why are the Kurds a known people? Why are they? Okay, this was my idea. Designing a museum of the Kurdish people, which is an educational center as well. I said something very simple to myself. Where do Kurdish people speak? Where is the Kurdish language spoken? Where is the Kurdish music being played? It's played in the former Soviet Union. It's played in Turkey. It's played in Syria. It's played in Iraq. It's played in Iran. So I created a building not about the emblem of Erbil and Kurdistan, but about the Kurds and what a noble people throughout their history. There are the fragments with the central courtyard with the 2 lines. One, the Anfal, the extermination of the Kurds that was attempted by Saddam Hussein. The other, looking forward to the future. Here's the model. It's a museum. You can see the citadel right on the left. So it's right next to the entrance of the citadel. And it's a UNESCO heritage site. And it's a dramatic museum that tells the story of the Kurdish people. I don't know how many of you know that in the League of Nations, the world, including Woodrow Wilson, voted for a country for the Kurds. And unfortunately, the Kurds don't have country, but they are a country that fights for the democratic values. They are a country that has been an ally of this country. I can't believe how cynical the world is. France, England, United States, the whole Western world is cynical. They've cheated the Kurds over and over again. And I've fallen in love with the Kurds and the Kurdish culture, which is, of course, Islamic, but it's also an open culture that traverses time. You know, the Babylonian Talmud was written just between those places which Kurdistan represents. You can see that huge cut into the building, which was directed towards the Anfal. The Anfal was the genocide against the Kurds. Saddam Hussein decided the only way to run Iraq is kill all the Kurds. Very similar to Erdogan. Let's kill the Kurds. Let's deprive them of their language. Let's deprive them of their rights. Let's pretend they don't exist. But they do exist. And I created a space with water, with echoes, with sounds. And by the way, I went to Halabja. I went to all those cities, and I interviewed people, older women, families. It was just like the stories I know from my own family. Genocide is ever present, whether in Rohingya, who's talking about the Rohingya? A genocide in our time. Who's talking about Syrian genocide? Who's talking about the genocides in Africa? This is part of architecture. And that central courtyard around which the museum exhibits develop, which talk about the freedom of the Kurdish people, the art of the Kurdish people, the stories, the rich culture that has been oppressed. And despite this oppression, they defied the world. The world told them, do not hold a referendum. We will punish you. We will close the airspace. We will deprive you of oil. We will deprive you of livelihood. And the Kurds said, no, we will fight to the death. I love these people. And then there is that beam that ascends to the level of the citadel, which is a kind of open space, a garden. At the end is a flame. The Kurds have, just like we have the flame of liberty, they have the Kurdish flame, the symbol of freedom. And it's a place that was under construction. Construction stopped, the war, 1 million refugees in Erbil. But I do hope that even architecture can have a modest impact to change people's ideas about the fact that people will never give up freedom. And we live in a society which is threatened in its freedoms. But I think it's easy to fall into line. But I think every architect, every person who is decent has to stand out and be counted as someone who is opposed to deprivation of freedom. And I end here, because it's already too long. No, I think almost correct. I'm rereading for the nth time my favorite book, Moby Dick, Melville. And this is the line I found in him. He's on the ship, and he says, just as a little meditation that Melville, the New Yorker, who, by the way, when he died, the New York Times had an obituary of 2 sentences. That was the obituary of the New York Times of the greatest American writer. 2 sentences. Well, you don't know art when it happens. Time, strength, cash, and patience. So that's all you need. Thank you very much.
Excuse me, from my perspective, I didn't actually see the mics, but they are behind these columns if people want to drop off the index card with questions. But if you take a seat, we can just start.
Or I can stand. Maybe it's better to stand.
I'm going to take this on for you.
Okay, thank you.
Your buildings do not appear derivative of existing work because they are not prototyped, tested. What are some of the biggest mistakes you've made that are visible in your completed works? Maybe some you've passed off as intentional. These are the dangers of these.
Well, first of all, I want to say, I try to put, 95% well-tested things in a building, so there would be no risk. But 5% of something that has never been done in a building It's the human DNA. I think we differ from the chicken only by 2% or 1%, our DNA. Very, very small difference. So mistakes. Sure, there's going to be, some, I'll give you an example. I was building my building in Bar Ilan University in Tel Aviv, Ramat Gan, and I was called, and somebody said, we made a mistake. We put the foundation several meters in the wrong place, and we have no money to do another foundation with limited budget. So you have to say, okay, we're going to have to cut the building in the position that was not intended to be cut. But to be fallible is not bad in architecture. You can. I like the buildings with mistakes. Look at the mistakes that Palladio made in all those buildings. When you look at the treatise of Palladio and see the numbers, like in Vicenza, all this, great villas, you realize that he had to do many compromises. And I think that's good. That's good. Don't ever be an architect, in my view, who says, this is the drawing and it's perfect. Because nothing is perfect.
Would you say that this is... I'm going to hijack the conversation later. I had a question in my notebook, and this is a good segue to it. Invariably, all architecture is in some form of conversation with history. And though you may not have articulated that, you are in some way both advocating for certain things, but also critiquing certain things. Now, I visited Taniguchi works when I was in Tokyo, and I noticed that the buildings were composed of grids, of structure, of wood, of seams, and so forth. And they seemed rather benign to somebody who didn't understand what craft it takes to make architecture.
Yeah.
But the reality is that he makes an architecture with zero tolerance because everything has to go around.
Well, look, I'm Jewish, I'm not Japanese. That's number one. That's number one. So maybe that explains it. I never thought about it, but think about this. The information era, we're in the information era. We are no longer in the industrial era. We're in the information technology era, is deeply anti-Semitic. And I tell you why. The Semites in the Sinai and in Syria, second century BC, 2,500 years to be exact, invented alphanumerical code, the alphabet, which tore the images that existed and put them into lines of text, put them into lines of a certain kind of logic, which is now being replaced by another code, which is replacing those lines with images. So that, because images are more open in the paradigm of control. So, when I say we live in a deeply anti-Semitic era, I mean the information technology era itself, which is rapidly replacing the linear, discursive, literate, conceptual ideas with images. Now, if I was Nietzsche, I would say eternal return of the same. We're returning to Egypt again. We're crossing the other way from the Red Sea. We're going back to the pharaohs, back to the images, back to the carved idols, back to mythology. And that's not a minor thought, because we feel this. When we use our phones, when we use our computers, we feel that we live in a pixelated world. And the pixels are more like firing of the neurons in the brain. They are disconnected. They're like the bullets that were fired in Vegas. There's a gap, if you listen to that machine gun, gap between the bullets. And each one is a pixel striking in a random way. To me, it was a kind of an expression of actually the way of thought, which is also rejection of law, rejection of thou shalt not kill, rejection of all the things that we grew up with for so many thousands of years. So it is an era of change, but really such a fundamental change. And where it goes is anyone's guess.
You showed many beautiful images, all the way going back to the days when you were a student. And this question asks you, how do you see potentials in never-built projects? That means other research you're doing today, maybe everything gets built these days, but how do they advance your thinking, and what are they? What are some of those projects that have not been built, and how are you changing the way that you're thinking through them?
It's a great question. Not easy to answer. Well, first of all, you have to love to draw, and you have to love the drawings of the masters. Study the drawings in the masters. If you go to the great museums, the great books that are available, study how they drew. How did a Guarini draw? How did he invent projective geometry? How did, Guardi do those paintings of Venice and the reflections of water? We're not alone. We are just irrelevant in the sense that there's so much amazing genius that the world has produced. So we are truly sort of dwarfs standing on the shoulders of giants. We can see farther, but we are not very large. And I think, I don't know how to say it, but you have to love something that you're doing. If you don't love it, drop it, because it's going to go nowhere. And if you're doing something that you are forced to do by somebody or through propaganda, you won't, it won't last you enough. So drawing is an act of some sort of a communion. I'm not Catholic, but I understand what a communion is. It's you become part of the flesh of the thing you draw. And you don't know where it's going. I wasn't cynical or funny when I said I have no goal. You have to allow the goal to appear unpredictably. For many years, my teachers, who are fantastic, many friends, thought that I wasted my time. I truly wasted my time. Like, I should have been doing work. My first building was built when I was about 55 years old. But something? Who cares? You gotta have patience, as Melville says. You don't have to start and do a lot of stuff. Now I'm lucky, fortunate that I'm able to do other buildings and other things. But you have to have a source, and that source is not you alone. It's not coming from you. You are not the source. That's the mistake most people make, that you're the source of creativity. So, source of creativity is outside. It's the people you love. It's the world that's showing you something interesting. It's, in fact, what you cannot control. And I would say that's what is real. What you can control is not real. It's an illusion. Only the uncontrollable is reality. And look how much uncontrollable is around us. From the cosmic to the microcosmic to the political to the economic. Yes, Rilke was right. We should be really wondering how to navigate in groundlessness. How to navigate in groundlessness. Because people always point to the ground. It's in the ground. But, what ground? When I was in Berlin, I thought the ground was not the physical Berlin. It wasn't the Berlin that you step into today. It's a groundless Berlin. It's a Berlin that's floating around you with all those names and addresses and people who are not Albert Einstein or Arnold Schoenberg or the great marvels, but regular working people. Some are living in the East or the West, and so that's kind of the need to connect yourself. And I don't know, everybody, there is no starting point. Do it anytime, at any point. And any starting point is as valid as any other. I've always wondered why humanity stuck to that idea that we find it comfortable to live in a box on the 15th floor. Whoever said that humanity would be comfortable living in a box on the 15th floor? It's an amazing adaptation. And as Richard Leakey says, just wait, it's almost midnight.
Here's a question that many of us relate to, and certainly I do, and maybe it impacts you too. How has being an immigrant impacted your creativity, your thinking, and how do you position yourself from that consciousness?
Great question. Who is not an immigrant? It's ridiculous that we even have we are all migrants. Everybody. Everybody's a migrant. So the idea of homelessness is not just the people we pass by without paying attention to them. We ourselves are in that condition, and put yourself in that condition. We might be more lucky because we do have a door, we do have safety, we have a roof over our head. But, you know, architecture often fosters the false feeling of security. You come from the city, then you're a New York architect. You really know New York. You come from Berlin, you're really a Berlin architect. You know Berlin. You come from Amsterdam, you really know this is my place. No, I never believed that. You know, we moved 14 times with our kids, many times across the ocean with no jobs. Very often people would say, hey, Mr. Libeskind, are you with the military? No. So are you in the diplomatic service? No. I think, you know, nomadic, going not just nomadic by taking a backpack, but try to live in a different society and see that people are pretty much the same all over the world. It's kind of amazing to me. You know, you think people are different, but they're pretty much the same. They all have some sort of soul. Really, it's an old word, but they have a soul, they have a heart. Deep down, there's some sort of a longing, some sort of insecurity also. So we are, you know, kind of one, despite all the evil ideologies which try to say we are first, we are the best, they are over there, we are over here. It's so much bullshit.
I think with that last word, it's a nice way to close the evening. It's a beautiful statement and a poignant ending. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.